It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Give me the keys, Julian Vane snapped, his hand outstretched and trembling with a cocktail-induced impatience. You don't look like you belong behind the wheel of anything more expensive than a golf cart, Arthur. The humid evening air at the Sterling Heights Yacht Club was thick with the scent of expensive sea salt cologne and the faint, briny tang of the Atlantic. Arthur Sterling stood his ground on the gravel path, his fingers curled around the fob of his 10-year-old sedan. He looked at the younger man, his future son-in-law, and saw a flash of the predator beneath the tailored Italian silk. Julian's face was flushed, his eyes darting toward the glittering lights of the clubhouse where the rehearsal dinner was already in full swing. The valet is backed up, Julian, Arthur said, his voice a low, steady rumble that had commanded boardrooms for 40 years. I was simply moving my own vehicle. There's no need for theatrics. Julian let out a sharp, jagged laugh that set Arthur's teeth on edge. He stepped closer, invading Arthur's personal space, the smell of high-end bourbon radiating from him. Theatrics. I'm trying to save Beatrice the embarrassment of seeing her father crawl out of a rust bucket in front of the Vane family's investors. Now, hand them over before I make a scene that even your daughter can't ignore. Arthur glanced toward the clubhouse entrance. Beatrice Sterling stood under the amber glow of the portico, flanked by Marcus Thorne. His daughter looked radiant in white lace, but her smile faltered as she watched the exchange. Marcus, Julian's best man, didn't even try to hide his smirk. He leaned against a marble pillar, checking his gold watch with a casual, practiced arrogance. "Is there a problem, Julian?" Beatrice called out, her voice carrying a note of strained anxiety. "Just helping your father find his place, darling," Julian shouted back, his tone flipping to a performative sweetness that made Arthur's skin crawl. He turned back to Arthur, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "Look at you, a tired old man in a polyester suit, clinging to a fleet of sinking ships. You're a relic, Arthur. Tomorrow I marry into this family, and on Monday I start liquidating the dead weight, starting with that office of yours." Arthur felt the weight of the silver signet ring on his pinky finger, a heavy, cold reminder of the empire he had built from a single tugboat. He didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply watched the way Julian's eyes never stayed still, the way he adjusted his cuffs as if the fabric itself was trying to escape his skin. "You talk a great deal about weight, Julian," Arthur said softly, "but you have no idea how deep the ocean really is." Julian rolled his eyes, snatching the keys from Arthur's hand with a sneer. He didn't notice the way the club's head steward, standing near the door, bowed slightly as Arthur passed, a gesture meant only for the man who secretly owned the very ground they stood upon. Julian was too busy tossing the keys to Marcus, who caught them with a mocking bow. Inside the dining room, the atmosphere was a curated display of Julian's perceived status. Crystal chandeliers hummed with a low electric gold, and the sound of heavy silver forks clattering against porcelain created a rhythmic, aggressive symphony of wealth. Julian took his seat at the head of the long mahogany table, holding court. He had placed Arthur at the very end, near the kitchen doors, where the smell of dish soap and the heat of the ovens threatened to overwhelm the scent of the lilies. "A toast," Julian announced, standing and raising a glass of vintage champagne that Arthur knew had been billed to the Sterling estate. To the future, to the merger of the Vane vision and the Sterling history, though, looking at the books, I'd say it's more of a rescue mission. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the room. Beatrice looked down at her plate, her cheeks pink. Silas Vance, sitting quietly at a side table reserved for staff and close associates, caught Arthur's eye. Silas, a man whose stillness was more threatening than Julian's loudest shout, gave a microscopic nod. He had the folders. He had the recordings. "Arthur, don't look so grim," Julian called out from across the room, his voice dripping with mock concern. "I know it's hard to watch your little tugboat business get swallowed by a real shark, but think of it as a retirement gift. You can finally trade in that suit for some pajamas, or perhaps a nice cardigan for the home." Marcus Thorne chuckled, leaning over to whisper something in Julian's ear that made both men erupt into fresh laughter. Arthur reached into his pocket and touched a small, weathered copper coin, the first profit he had ever made. The metal was warm against his thumb. He looked at Julian, really looked at him, and saw the cracks in the foundation. The fraudulent venture capital, the secret debts, the arrogance that blinded him to the fact that he was currently insulting a man who could erase his existence with a single phone call. "I've spent 40 years on the water, Julian," Arthur said, his voice cutting through the laughter like a prow through fog. The room went silent. Even the servers paused. "The one thing I've learned is that the loudest waves are always the shallowest. It's the deep water you have to worry about. The kind that doesn't make a sound until it's already over your head." Julian's smirk didn't falter, but his grip on his wine glass tightened. "Very poetic, Arthur. But in the real world, money talks and old men fade away. Enjoy your dinner. It's likely the last one you'll have on my tab." Julian turned back to Beatrice, dismissing Arthur as if he were a ghost. Arthur sat back, his expression unreadable. He felt a strange, cold peace settling over him. He had wanted to give Julian a chance for Beatrice's sake, but the boy had mistaken modesty for weakness. As the main course was served, Arthur felt his phone vibrate in his pocket. A text from Sila's. "Everything is secured. Clara Vane is on the flight." Arthur took a slow sip of water, watching Julian brag to a group of investors about a property deal that didn't exist. The countdown had begun. Julian Vane thought he was ascending to a throne, but he was merely walking onto the deck of a ship that Arthur Sterling was about to scuttle. 2 days, Arthur whispered to himself, the words lost in the roar of the party. "You have 2 days left to be a king, Julian. Make them count." The next morning, the air at the waterfront construction site tasted of salt and diesel. Arthur Sterling stood at the edge of the jagged concrete pier, his simple wool coat fluttering in the sharp Atlantic breeze. He looked out at the massive steel skeleton of what Julian called the Vane legacy, a glass and steel monstrosity that was currently eating into the very foundations of the harbor Arthur's grandfather had built. The silence of the morning was shattered by the high-pitched scream of a red Ferrari. It tore through the construction gates, kicking up a cloud of gray dust before slamming to a halt inches from where Arthur stood. Julian Vane stepped out, his Italian leather loafers crunching on the gravel. He didn't offer a greeting. Instead, he adjusted his sapphire blue silk tie and checked the heavy gold watch on his wrist, the metal glinting aggressively in the early light. "Still wearing that same coat, Arthur?" Julian asked, his voice carrying that familiar, oily condescension. He gestured vaguely at the older man's attire as Marcus Thorne climbed out of the passenger side, clutching a leather briefcase like a devoted hound. "I told Beatrice you'd be here. Honestly, it's a bit pathetic, lurking around the docks like a ghost of Christmas past. You're holding up the future." "The pier has been in my family for 4 generations, Julian," Arthur said, his voice steady and low. "There are procedures for transferring heritage land. It isn't just about moving dirt. It's about moving money, which you clearly don't have," Julian snapped. He snatched a clipboard from Marcus and shoved it toward Arthur's chest. "Sign the waiver for the deep-water dredging. It's a formality, but I'm tired of my lawyers calling me about historical preservation nonsense. You're just a line item I'm ready to cross off." He leaned in closer, the scent of his expensive, cloying cologne masking the sea air. "Don't make me ask Beatrice to handle her difficult father. It would be a shame if she had to choose between your nostalgia and the penthouse I'm building for her at the top of this tower." Arthur didn't take the pen. He didn't even look at the paper. He watched Julian turn away to bark orders at a group of shivering foremen, his movements frantic and fueled by an arrogance that bordered on mania. As Julian walked toward the skeletal elevator, Silas Vance stepped out from the shadow of a parked black sedan 50 yards away. The driver moved with the silent, predatory grace of a man who had spent 20 years in shadows. He stopped beside Arthur, his eyes fixed on the red Ferrari. "He's over-leveraged, sir," Silas whispered, his voice barely audible over the crashing waves. "He used the Sterling name to secure a $40 million bridge loan from the Valois Group." He told them you were a silent partner. If they find out the collateral is contested, the bank will pull the plug within the hour. Arthur felt the cold, hard weight of a burner phone in his coat pocket. And Clara. She lands at 6 this evening, Silas confirmed. She has the original marriage certificate and the records of the offshore accounts Marcus helped him hide in the Caymans. She's ready to talk. Arthur looked back at the steel beams. Julian thought he was ascending to the heavens. He was actually standing on a trapdoor, and Arthur finally had his hand on the lever. Julian returned a moment later, his face flushed with a petty, restless triumph. "I've had a thought, Arthur," he said, loud enough for the construction workers to pause and listen. "Since you're so attached to this rotting wood, I'll let you keep a small corner of the pier. We'll put the trash compactors and the grease traps there. A little tribute to the Sterling legacy. It suits you." Marcus Thorne let out a sharp, sycophantic laugh. "Very poetic, Julian." Arthur simply nodded, a thin, ghost-like smile touching his lips. "I appreciate the offer. I'll see you at the gala tomorrow night, Julian. I assume the invitations are still valid." "If the security guards recognize you," Julian sneered, sliding back into his car. "Try to find a suit that doesn't smell like mothballs. It's a high-class event, not a charity ward." The Ferrari roared to life, spraying gravel against Arthur's shins as it sped away. Arthur watched the dust settle. He touched the phone in his pocket, feeling the vibration of an incoming message. 24 hours, Silas," Arthur said softly. "Let him have his party. The higher he climbs, the more air he'll need on the way down." 2 days had passed since the confrontation at the pier, and the scent of cedarwood and old parchment filled Arthur Sterling's private library, a sanctuary of leather-bound history that Julian Vane had once mocked as a room full of dead trees. Arthur sat behind his mahogany desk, his fingers tracing the edge of a heavy, wax-sealed manila envelope. The room was silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock that sounded like a countdown. Silas Vance stood by the window, his silhouette sharp against the morning light. He didn't need to speak. The dossier on the desk spoke for him. He had spent 48 hours submerged in the digital shadows and paper trails that Julian thought he had erased years ago. "It's all there, Arthur," Silas said, his voice as level as a horizon line. "The offshore accounts, the shell companies used to drain the Sterling pension fund, and the most important piece, the one he spent a fortune to bury." Arthur opened the envelope. He didn't rush. He pulled out a single, high-resolution photograph of a marriage certificate from a small municipality in Europe, followed by a series of recent bank transfers. The name on the documents wasn't Beatrice. It was Clara Vane. "He's still sending her money," Arthur murmured, his eyes narrowing as he read the ledger. "Even while he's picking out engagement rings for my daughter." "He never divorced her," Silas confirmed. "The marriage is legal, binding, and very much active. Julian isn't just a fraud, he's a bigamist in waiting. He needs Beatrice's inheritance to pay off the debt he owes to the Vulture Fund, or they'll do more than just sue him." Arthur felt a cold, sharp spark of clarity. He touched the silver letter opener on his desk, its metal freezing against his skin. This wasn't just a business dispute anymore. It was a surgical strike. While Arthur studied the wreckage of a con man's life, Julian Vane was miles away, standing in the center of a penthouse suite at the Grand Imperial Hotel. He was surrounded by the rustle of Italian silk and the faint, cloying scent of expensive cologne. A tailor knelt at his feet, pinning the hem of a tuxedo that cost more than most people earned in a year. "Careful with the stitch, old man," Julian snapped, looking down at the tailor with a sneer. "If you snag the fabric, I'll have your shop turned into a parking lot by Monday." Marcus Thorne sat on a velvet sofa nearby, swirling a glass of amber scotch. He let out a short, sycophantic laugh. "I don't think he understands who he's working for, Julian. You'd think the view from the 50th floor would give him a hint." Julian checked his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror, adjusting his silk tie with the casual, practiced arrogance of a man who believed he had already won. "The view is fine, Marcus, but it'll be better tomorrow night. Once the gala is over and the papers are signed, the Sterling name becomes a footnote. I'm going to strip that shipping empire down to the bolts and sell it for scrap." "And the old man?" Marcus asked, a smirk playing on his lips. He seemed pretty attached to that peer. "Arthur is a relic," Julian said, his voice dripping with contempt. "He's a ghost haunting a graveyard. Tomorrow I'm going to hand him a gold watch and a map to the nearest assisted living facility. And Beatrice, she'll be too busy planning a wedding that's never going to happen to realize I've already moved her trust fund into my private equity accounts." He stepped off the tailoring platform, nearly knocking the elderly man over. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't even look back. Julian walked to the window, looking out over the city as if he already owned the streets below. "I want the security at the gala to be airtight. If Arthur shows up in that moth-eaten suit of his, I want him escorted to the kitchen. Let him eat with the staff. It's where he belongs." Back in the library, the quiet was interrupted by the soft chime of a cell phone. Arthur picked it up. It was a message from Beatrice Sterling. "Father, please don't be difficult tomorrow. Julian has a big surprise planned for the gala. He says it's the start of a new era for all of us." Arthur deleted the message. He looked at the photograph of Clara Vane one last time before sliding it into a slim, elegant briefcase. He felt no hesitation, only the steady, cold pulse of a man who had spent 40 years navigating treacherous waters. Julian Vane thought he was the predator, but he had forgotten that the most dangerous thing in the ocean wasn't the shark that splashed. It was the one that stayed beneath the surface. "Silas," Arthur said, standing up. His posture was no longer that of a tired old man. He looked like the titan who had built a city from a single dock. "Call the board of directors. Tell them I'll be making a personal presentation at the gala tomorrow night. And find Clara. I want her in the city by sunset." "She's already on a flight," Silas replied. "What about the security guards Julian hired?" Arthur reached into his desk and pulled out a small, gold-embossed card, the deed to the hotel where the gala was being held. He had purchased the holding company through a blind trust 6 months ago, a move Julian's brilliant financial team had completely missed. "They work for me," Arthur said, a thin, ghost-like smile touching his lips. "They just don't know it yet." He walked to the window, watching the sun begin to dip below the skyline. The countdown was no longer ticking in his head. It was a roar. 24 hours. In 24 hours, Julian Vane would be standing on the highest stage in the city, ready to claim a throne that didn't exist. Arthur touched the briefcase, the leather smooth and cool under his hand. He could wait. He had the patience of the tide, and the tide was finally coming in. Tomorrow night, the world would see Julian for exactly what he was, and Arthur would be there to watch the light go out in his eyes. The morning of the gala rehearsal, the Grand Meridian Ballroom was a cavern of organized chaos. Arthur Sterling stood near the velvet-draped entrance, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the frantic preparations. The air was thick with the cloying, funeral scent of 10,000 white lilies, a choice Julian had made to signal purity and power. To Arthur, the heavy fragrance merely smelled like something was being buried. Julian Vane strode across the polished marble, the sharp, rhythmic clack of his Italian leather loafers echoing like gunfire against the high ceilings. He was barking orders into a headset, his bespoke navy suit tailored so tightly it looked like it might burst under the pressure of his own ego. He spotted Arthur and didn't even break his stride, though his lip curled in a familiar, jagged sneer. "Why is he still here?" Julian snapped, not to Arthur, but to Beatrice, who was trailing behind him with a digital tablet. "I told security the guest list was for tomorrow, not for a senior citizen's outing." Beatrice looked down, her face flushing a deep, uncomfortable red as she avoided her father's gaze. "Dad wanted to see the layout, Julian. He's in the way," Julian interrupted, finally stopping inches from the older man. He didn't smell like lilies. He smelled of expensive, aggressive cologne and the metallic tang of unearned confidence. He looked Arthur up and down, his eyes lingering on the modest, well-pressed tweed jacket. "You look like a lost professor, Arthur. This isn't a classroom. It's a coronation. My coronation. If you can't afford a tuxedo that hasn't been in a mothball box since the 80s, I'll have Silas drop one off at your little apartment. Consider it a parting gift." Arthur didn't flinch. He glanced past Julian toward a group of security guards standing by the service entrance. One of them, a broad-shouldered man named Miller, caught his eye. Julian had spent the last hour screaming at Miller about the placement of the velvet ropes, but the moment the guard saw Arthur, his posture shifted. He didn't bow, but he stood a fraction straighter, a silent acknowledgement of the man who actually signed his paychecks. Julian, too blinded by his own reflection in the ballroom's gold-leafed mirrors, noticed nothing. "The lighting is too dim on the podium," Julian continued, turning back to the room and gesturing wildly. "I need the spotlight to be blinding when I announce the Thorne merger. I want everyone to see the exact moment the Sterling name becomes a footnote in my history." "You should be careful with spotlights, Julian," Arthur said softly. His voice was a stark contrast to the younger man's frantic energy, cool, steady, and dangerously patient. "They have a tendency to reveal the cracks in the foundation." Julian let out a sharp, barking laugh that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. "Cracks! Look around you, old man. This is the finest hotel in the city. The Thorne money is moving into the accounts as we speak. There are no cracks, only a new empire." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a hiss that only Arthur could hear. "Tomorrow night, I'm taking everything. The company, the reputation, and your daughter's loyalty. You're not a lion, Arthur. You're a rug." He reached out and flicked Arthur's lapel with a dismissive finger, a public gesture of contempt that made the nearby florists whisper and turn away. "Go home. Get some rest. You'll need it for the move. I hear the state-run facilities have very nice gardens for people with your diminished capacity." Julian turned his back, already shouting at a technician about the sound system. Beatrice lingered for a second, her eyes searching Arthur's face for a sign of hurt or anger, but she found only a terrifyingly calm resolve. She hurried after her fiancé, her heels clicking a frantic, subservient rhythm behind his arrogant stride. Arthur reached into his pocket and felt the heavy, gold-embossed card, the deed to the very floor Julian was standing on. He looked up at the chandelier, the light refracting into 1,000 jagged shards. He didn't feel like a rug. He felt like the deep, silent water before a dam breaks. Sela's Vance appeared at his shoulder, his presence as unobtrusive as a shadow. "The final documents are signed, sir. The hotel staff has been briefed. They are waiting for your signal." Arthur checked his watch, the metal cool against his skin. 12 hours, Sela's. "And Julian, sir." Arthur watched Julian standing on the podium, gesturing at the empty chairs he expected to rule tomorrow. "Let him enjoy his throne for one more night," Arthur said, his voice as cold as the marble beneath his feet. "The higher he climbs, the more spectacular the fall will be." The evening arrived with a deceptive stillness that masked the storm brewing within the gilded walls of the Sterling Plaza. By 7 o'clock, the ballroom was a sea of shimmering silk and sharp wool, the air heavy with the cloying scent of white lilies and Julian Vane's aggressive, overpriced cologne. Arthur Sterling stood near the periphery, his modest charcoal suit a stark contrast to the peacocking displays of wealth surrounding him. He watched the light from the massive crystal chandeliers refract into jagged shards against the polished marble floor, each spark a reminder of the empire he had built and the man who currently thought he was stealing it. Julian stood at the center of a circle of investors, his laughter booming with a forced, hollow confidence. He adjusted his silk bow tie, his $50,000 watch catching the light as he gestured wildly. Marcus Thorne stood at his elbow, playing the part of the loyal lieutenant, though his eyes darted toward the exits with a frequency that suggested a man looking for a life raft. "Arthur, there you are," Julian called out, his voice cutting through the hum of the string quartet. He didn't walk toward his future father-in-law, he beckoned him over like a servant. As Arthur approached, Julian leaned in, loud enough for the nearby socialites to hear. "I was worried you'd gotten lost in the parking garage. It's a bit more sophisticated than the retirement homes you're used to, isn't it?" A few of the younger associates chuckled. Arthur simply offered a thin, patient smile. "The architecture is indeed impressive, Julian. I'm quite familiar with the foundations of this building." "Foundations? You sound like a contractor," Julian sneered, turning back to his circle. He's a bit quaint, isn't he? Still thinks the world is built on handshakes and hard work. Marcus, get this man a glass of water. He looks like he's about to wilt under the pressure of a real event. The dismissal was sharp, a calculated public jab designed to remind everyone in the room who held the new keys to the kingdom. Arthur felt the cold, heavy weight of the gold-embossed master keycard in his pocket, a tactile anchor in a room full of illusions. He didn't take the water. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the grand staircase where Beatrice Sterling was descending. She looked breathtaking in a gown of midnight blue, but her face was a mask of strained composure. She moved toward Julian, who didn't even turn to greet her until she touched his arm. "Julian, the board members are asking about the final signatures," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Julian didn't lower his voice. "Not now, Beatrice. Can't you see I'm middle of a deal? Go find your father and stay out of the way. This isn't a family dinner, it's a coronation." The color drained from her face as she recoiled from the verbal slap. She looked at her father, her eyes pleading for a comfort he couldn't yet give. Arthur's jaw tightened, his pulse drumming a steady, lethal rhythm against his collar. The rage was there, cold and sharp, but he channeled it into the plan. He caught the eye of a passing waiter, a young man named Leo who had worked at the plaza for 6 years. The waiter didn't just offer a tray. He gave Arthur a nearly imperceptible bow, his eyes full of a recognition that Julian was too arrogant to notice. "Everything is in place for the banquet, sir," Leo murmured. "Thank you, Leo. Ensure the audiovisual team is standing by," Arthur replied, his voice a low murmur. Julian, seeing the exchange, barked a laugh. "Ordering appetizers already, Arthur? Don't worry, I've paid for the premium catering. Even you might find something you can digest." Arthur ignored the insult, his focus shifting to the back of the room where Sela's Vance stood near the heavy oak doors. Sela's gave a single, sharp nod. The evidence was secured. The witness was waiting. The trap was fully formed, and Julian was currently dancing in the center of it, oblivious to the tripwire beneath his feet. As the clock struck 8, the doors to the main banquet hall swung open. The sound was like a gavel striking a bench. Julian stepped toward the podium at the front of the room, his chest puffed out, his hand gripping Marcus's shoulder with a proprietary air. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian's voice boomed through the speakers, "tonight we celebrate the end of an old era and the birth of a new one. The Sterling name has had its run, but the Vane era begins tonight." He looked directly at Arthur, a smirk of pure, unadulterated triumph twisting his features. He felt invincible, standing on a stage he hadn't earned, surrounded by people he had bought with lies. He reached for the microphone, his movements theatrical and slow, savoring the moment of his perceived victory. Arthur moved through the crowd, not toward the back, but toward the front row. He took his seat directly in Julian's line of sight. He didn't look like a defeated man. He looked like a predator watching a moth fly into a flame. "Before we begin the toast," Julian said, his eyes gleaming with malice, "I'd like to invite Arthur Sterling up here. I think it's only fair that he gives us a few words on what it feels like to finally step down." The room went silent, the tension thick enough to choke the air. Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Marcus Thorne looked like he wanted to vanish into the floorboards. Julian leaned back against the podium, crossing his arms, waiting for the old man to stumble through a humiliated goodbye. Arthur stood up. He didn't use the stairs. He walked toward the side of the stage, his footsteps echoing with a heavy, deliberate finality on the hardwood. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked only at Julian. "You're right about one thing, Julian," Arthur said, his voice amplified by the microphone he hadn't even touched yet, his own portable unit clicking on from his lapel. "Tonight is about foundations, and yours are made of sand." Julian's smirk flickered, a shadow of confusion crossing his face as the lights in the ballroom suddenly dimmed, and the massive projector screen behind him began to hum with power. Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, black remote. "Wait for it," Arthur whispered, loud enough for only the two of them to hear. Julian Vane stood frozen at the podium, his mouth still curved in the remnants of a smug grin that no longer fit the room's sudden, chilling atmosphere. Behind him, the massive screen didn't display the merger documents he had expected. Instead, it showed a high-resolution scan of a marriage license from a county clerk's office in Nevada, dated 4 years ago. The names were unmistakable: Julian Vane and Clara Vane. The ballroom, once filled with the clinking of crystal and the low hum of polite conversation, fell into a silence so absolute it felt heavy. Julian's skin didn't just pale. It turned a sickly, translucent gray, the kind of color seen on a fish left too long on the dock. His eyes, usually sharp and predatory, glazed over with a frantic, uncomprehending light as they darted from the screen to the crowd. His lower lip began a microscopic tremor that he couldn't suppress, even as his hand gripped the mahogany podium so hard the wood groaned under the pressure. The arrogant tilt of his chin collapsed, his neck seemingly losing the strength to support his head, as the reality of the image behind him began to sink into the collective consciousness of the room. He looked smaller. Suddenly, the expensive Italian wool of his suit hanging off a frame that seemed to have shrunk 3 sizes under the weight of the damning light. That's a forgery," Julian stammered, his voice cracking, a thin, desperate sound that lacked any of his previous authority. He looked toward Beatrice Sterling, who was standing near the front row. Beatrice didn't move. She stared at the screen, her face a mask of dawning horror. The diamond engagement ring Julian had placed on her finger only an hour ago seemed to catch the light from the projector, mocking her. She looked at the man she thought she knew, then back at the legal document that proved he was already a husband. Her hand flew to her mouth, a sharp, audible gasp escaping her as she took a stumbling step backward, physically distancing herself from the man at the podium. Marcus Thorne, Julian's supposed best man, didn't offer a word of support. He stared at the screen with a calculated, cold expression, already shifting his body away from Julian as if the man were suddenly radioactive. To Julian's left, Silas Vance stepped out from the shadows near the service entrance, his arms crossed over his chest, a ghost of a satisfied smile playing on his lips. The screen flickered again. This time it wasn't a document, but a live video feed. A woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and a weary expression appeared on the screen. "Julian," Clara Vane said, her voice amplified through the ballroom's state-of-the-art sound system. "I told you I'd find you eventually. You can't just walk away from a marriage and a mountain of debt by changing your last name and finding a new mark." The room erupted. It wasn't a roar, but a frantic, ugly hive of whispers. 2 board members of Sterling Shipping stood up simultaneously, their faces twisted in disgust. One of them, a man who had been Julian's loudest supporter only minutes ago, hissed a single word: "Fraud." Arthur Sterling stepped forward into the light of the projector, the blue glow of the marriage certificate washing over his calm features. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man who had finally finished a tedious chore. He walked to the edge of the stage, looking up at the man who had tried to steal his legacy. "You spent so much time looking at my age, Julian, that you forgot to look at your own trail," Arthur said, his voice quiet but carrying to the very back of the hall. "You thought I was a relic. You thought this empire was a fruit ready to be plucked by the first man with a shiny suit and a loud voice." Julian tried to speak, his throat working convulsively, but no words came out. He looked at the exit, but Silas was already there, joined by 2 uniformed men who didn't look like gala security. Arthur reached out and took the microphone from the podium, his fingers brushing Julian's trembling hand. Julian flinched as if he'd been burned. "Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of a new beginning," Arthur told the stunned audience, his gaze sweeping over the room. "And it is, but it's a beginning for the Sterling family, not for the vultures circling it." He turned back to Julian, leaning in just enough so the microphone didn't catch his next words. "I told you your foundations were made of sand. I just didn't realize how much of that sand was stolen." Arthur didn't wait for a response. He didn't stay to watch the police climb the stairs to the stage, or to hear Beatrice's sobbing questions. He simply turned and walked off the stage, his footsteps steady and rhythmic on the hardwood. He walked past Sela's, giving a single, sharp nod, and exited through the heavy oak doors into the cool night air, leaving the chaos of his own making behind him. The silence that followed Arthur's departure was more deafening than the applause that had preceded it. In the center of the stage, Julian stood frozen, the heavy scent of ozone from the abandoned microphone clinging to him like a shroud. The ballroom, once a sea of admiring faces, had transformed into a cage of judgmental eyes. "This is a mistake," Julian finally barked, his voice cracking as it echoed off the gilded ceiling. He looked toward the front row, searching for a friendly face, but found only a wall of cold indifference. "Beatrice, tell them. Your father is old, he's confused, he's trying to sabotage the merger." Beatrice Sterling didn't move toward him. Instead, she took a deliberate step back, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. The sound was like a gavel striking. She looked at the man she had almost married as if seeing a stranger, her face pale but her gaze unwavering. "He isn't the one who's confused, Julian. I think I'm finally seeing things clearly for the first time." Two uniformed officers ascended the stairs, their heavy boots thudding with a rhythmic finality that drowned out Julian's protests. Behind them followed a man in a sharp, charcoal suit, Arthur's lead counsel, carrying a leather briefcase that seemed to hold the weight of Julian's entire world. Julian's face underwent a grotesque transformation. The arrogant smirk that had been his armor for months didn't just fade, it curdled. His skin, usually a pampered, bronzed hue, turned a sickly, translucent gray, making the sweat beads on his forehead stand out like oil on water. His eyes, once sharp with predatory intent, darted frantically, losing focus as the pupils dilated until they were nothing but dark pits of panic. His lower lip began a rhythmic, uncontrollable tremor that he tried to bite back, but his jaw had gone slack, leaving his mouth hanging open in a silent, jagged O. The veins in his neck pulsed with a frantic, visible thrum, straining against the silk of his designer tie, as if the very fabric were beginning to choke him. "Marcus," Julian hissed, turning to his best man who stood near the wings. "Marcus, get the car. Call the firm. Tell them we're being harassed." Marcus Thorne didn't reach for his phone. Instead, he reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a silver flash drive, handing it directly to the lead officer. "Everything you need is on here," Marcus said, his voice devoid of emotion. "The offshore routings, the forged signatures on the Sterling shipping manifests, and the communication logs." "I won't be going down for his ego." The betrayal hit Julian like a physical blow. He stumbled back, nearly tripping over the floral arrangements. "You traitor!" he breathed, the words tasting like ash. "I made you." "You used me," Marcus countered, stepping away to join the growing circle of witnesses who were now openly recording the collapse with their phones. "And Arthur Sterling gave me a way out. I'd suggest you stop talking." The side doors of the ballroom swung open, and the crowd parted as a woman in a simple, elegant navy dress walked toward the stage. Julian's knees visibly buckled. It was Clara Vane. She wasn't the ghost he had tried to bury in a mountain of legal NDAs and threats. She was the living evidence of his greatest lie. "Hello, Julian," Clara said, her voice calm and carrying through the hushed room. She held up a single, notarized document. "The divorce was never finalized. You couldn't afford the settlement back then, so you just disappeared. I believe bigamy carries a rather significant prison sentence, doesn't it?" A collective gasp rippled through the audience. The venture capitalist of the year was nothing more than a common fraud and a runaway husband. The officers moved in, the metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut over Julian's wrists. The sound was thin and sharp, signaling the end of his reign. He was led down the stairs, no longer a titan of industry, but a man being escorted out of a room that had already forgotten his name. At the heavy oak exit, Arthur stood waiting. He hadn't left the building. He had simply been waiting for the trash to be collected. He looked immaculate, the cool night air having ruffled his hair just enough to give him the appearance of a man who had just finished a pleasant stroll. As the police brought Julian level with him, the younger man stopped, his breathing ragged. "You think you've won?" Julian spat, though the words lacked their usual venom. "I'll be out in 48 hours. My lawyers will tear your evidence apart." Arthur stepped closer, his presence commanding and quiet. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Julian, you've spent so much time looking at the horizon that you forgot to check the hull of your own ship. I didn't just find your frauds. I bought your debt. Every cent you owe to the firms in London, the creditors in New York, and the people you stepped on to get here. It all belongs to me now." Arthur leaned in, his voice a cold whisper. "You aren't going to a lawyer. You're going to a cell. And when you get out, you won't have a penny, a friend, or a floor to sleep on in this city. I've made sure of that." Arthur gave a slight nod to the officers. "Take him away. He's polluting the air." Julian tried to lung forward, a desperate, feral sound escaping his throat, but the officers jerked him back, dragging him through the doors and into the waiting glare of police lights and paparazzi. Arthur watched the cruiser pull away, the red and blue strobes reflecting in his calm eyes. Silas stepped up beside him, holding Arthur's overcoat. "Is it finished, sir?" Silas asked. Arthur looked back at the ballroom where Beatrice was standing in the doorway, her head held high as she spoke with the remaining guests, reclaiming the sterling dignity. "No, Silas," Arthur said, turning toward the shadows of the parking lot. "The reckoning is over. Now we begin the cleanup." 6 months had passed since the flashing blue and red strobes of the police cruisers had faded into the night, taking the noise and the filth of Julian Vane with them. Arthur Sterling sat on the wide stone veranda of his estate, the morning sun warming his hands as he held a porcelain cup of Earl Grey. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine, a quiet, honest fragrance that the man who had tried to steal this life would never have understood. Arthur watched the distant harbor through a pair of vintage brass binoculars. The Sterling fleet was moving with a renewed, rhythmic precision. He had spent the last 24 weeks gutting the rot Julian had introduced into the company, cutting away the fraudulent contracts and the shadow accounts like a surgeon removing a tumor. It hadn't just been about the billions. It was about the integrity of a name that had stood for a century before Julian was even a thought. A folded newspaper sat on the wicker table beside him. The headline on page 4 was small, tucked away where the important people wouldn't have to look at it for long. "Vane sentenced to 12 years for grand larceny and securities fraud." There were no more Italian silk suits for Julian, no more Porsches or penthouse views. Silas had informed Arthur that Julian was now wearing a stiff, ill-fitting jumpsuit that smelled of industrial bleach and failure. His assets had been liquidated to the last cent to pay back the investors he had bled dry. Even his pride had been auctioned off. The media had moved on to the next scandal, leaving Julian to rot in a cell where no one cared about his visionary venture capital. Silas Vance stepped onto the veranda, his footsteps light on the stone. He wasn't wearing his driver's uniform today, but a well-cut charcoal suit that reflected his new role as Arthur's head of security and private operations. He looked younger, the tension that had lived in his shoulders for years finally dissolved. "The final audit is complete, sir," Silas said, his voice as steady as a heartbeat. "Clara Vane has received the settlement from the liquidated estate. She's moved back to her family's farm in Vermont. She sent a note. She's finally changed her name back to her maiden one. She sounds at peace." Arthur nodded slowly. "And Marcus Thorne." "Working as a night manager at a roadside motel in a town no one visits," Silas replied, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "He's blacklisted from every financial firm on the coast. He traded his testimony for a plea deal, but he lost his soul in the process. He'll never hold a cent of someone else's money again." The sound of light footsteps announced the arrival of Beatrice Sterling. She looked different now. The sharp, defensive edge Julian had cultivated in her had softened into something more contemplative and resilient. She wore a simple linen dress, her hair pulled back, no longer the polished trophy Julian had demanded she be. She sat in the chair across from Arthur, the chair Julian used to occupy during those tense, arrogant dinners. She didn't fill the space with frantic, greedy energy. She just sat, watching the horizon. He called again yesterday, Beatrice said quietly. From the correctional facility. He tried to tell me that if I talked to the board, if I told them it was all a misunderstanding of his methods, he could be out in 3 years. Arthur didn't move. He didn't even blink. And what did you tell him, Beatrice? I didn't tell him anything, she said, her voice firm. I listened to him scramble for 30 seconds, the same old lies, the same entitlement, and then I hung up. I realized I didn't hate him anymore. I just felt nothing. He's a ghost, Dad. He was never really there. But the cost was still visible in the way she looked at the world. She was more guarded now, her trust a fragile thing that Arthur knew would take years to fully heal. Julian hadn't just stolen money. He had stolen the innocence of her affection, replacing it with a cynical wisdom no daughter should have to learn from her own husband. That was the debt Julian could never repay, no matter how many years he spent behind bars. Arthur set his teacup down with a soft click. He looked at the empty chair across from him. It was just wood and fabric now, stripped of the man who had tried to claim it as a throne. The house was quieter, the staff smaller, and the social invitations fewer, but the air was finally clean. The cleanup is over, Silas, Arthur said, standing up to look over his domain. He felt the weight of the last year finally lift, leaving behind a cold, hard satisfaction. He walked to the edge of the veranda, his hand resting on the cool stone railing. Below, the gardeners were replanting the hedges Julian had ordered removed. Life was returning to the way it was meant to be. Arthur Sterling had been the sleeping lion, and while the hunt had been exhausting, the territory was once again his. He watched a single Sterling ship disappear past the breakwater, heading into the open sea, leaving the wreckage of Julian Vane's ambition far behind in the wake.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.